So after a slightly subpar race around the streets of Baku, F1 had a chance to improve just a week later in Canada, because apparently an almost 9,000 kilometers between circuits makes perfect sense for a doubleheader. But the teams and drivers would be returning to the circuit Gilles Villeneuve, as for the first time since 2019, we were in Canada, a country who's best known for ice hockey, maple syrup, and being the world's biggest exporter of modern-day F1 pay drivers. Coming into the race, it was Max Verstappen heading up the driver's title, as he led Sergio Perez by 21 points, and given Red Bull had their drivers in first and second place, they were well clear in the constructors with an 80-point gap to Ferrari behind, helped out by the fact that in Baku, Ferrari were about as reliable as the UK government. Down towards the back of the standings, after a good result for Sebastian Vettel, Aston Martin had caught up to Haas in terms of points. Well, I say Haas, but given the way Mick Schumacher's performances have been going, it's really just Kevin Magnussen. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 9 in Canada. Before we get going, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, it always helps out with YouTube's algorithm, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all of my F1 content. We're on the road to 10k subs and the support is always appreciated. Now with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Canadian Grand Prix. So on to the build-up news, and in the run-up to Canada we had a lot of talk surrounding the issues of porpoising and if the FIA should be changing the rules to reduce it, with the teams that were having big issues, not talking about anyone in particular, pushing for change to restrict how much porpoising the cars would get. But with some teams seemingly much more on top of the effect following the new regulations, it's a bit like, well, this. But in fairness, apparently 19 drivers were saying how uncomfortable it is and that it could do with looking into, with the odd driver out being Fernando Alonso, as he claimed his body was still young and could take it. Bear in mind, he has also just set the record for the longest F1 career, so I'll leave it to you to decide on the Spaniard's youth status. But come Thursday evening, there was the news that the FIA would indeed be developing some rules regarding the porpoising, and that it would be looking into both longer and shorter term solutions. Elsewhere, we had a lot of rumours surrounding driver transfers, with a fair amount of these regarding a new face at Williams, as they were looking to increase the number of cars they ran at races, given one basically spends the entire time on their own doing parade laps and basically not existing. Now the driver looking for a seat was Alpine Reserve and F2 champion Oscar Piastri, with the idea being he would take the one currently occupied by Nicholas Latifi, as even in Formula 1 there comes a point where your dad's money and love of Nutella can't compensate for you making an F1 car look no quicker than a go-kart. And finally, we got the news that Albert Park in Australia had been extended and would be on the calendar until at least 2035, with the agreement allowing for 5 of those races to be the season opener, as after losing the perk during COVID times, it seemed Melbourne was trying to wrestle some of the hype back from Bahrain, and alongside the F1 races would be support from the F2 and F3 Junior Series for the very first time. So on to Friday action, and with the dark clouds and bad weather looming, the teams were eager to get out on track and get some running under their belts, and one of those excited to be racing in Canada was Nicholas Latifi. Well, I say race, but it's more like 3 days of test running. But in the other Williams, the limits were starting to be pushed, as Alex Albon had to cut the final chicane, not eager to be the first car into the Wall of Champions. But that's an issue that Esteban Ocon would be happy to have, as in his car the problems were even worse, with a piece of paper towel getting into the brakes and taking away all of its cooling, bringing the Alpine into the pits. And across the garage there were some close calls with Fernando Alonso pushing his car to the limits, or in this case, the wall, having a wobble at the Wall of Champions and just managing to correct the snap before he hit the barrier, which was something that Yuki Tsunoda couldn't do, as he took it a step further and hit the wall but managed to get away pretty much unscathed. But pushing the limits is what F1 is all about, and it's something the locals were doing. No, I'm not talking about Lance Stroll being quick for a change, I'm talking about this little guy, who posed the age-old question of why did the groundhog cross the road, the answer being to get a photo with Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz. But the main talking point through FP1 was the technical directive introduced by the FIA, which would aim to control the amount of porpoising that cars had, with the idea being to limit the vertical G-force as opposed to a mandatory ride height, meaning that while Mercedes got their wish for an FIA intervention, it would be in such a way that would still most likely cost them time. On to the second practice session, and we got news of some penalties, with Yuki Tsunoda having enough components replaced to start the back of the grid. But he wasn't the only alpha with some car issues, as Valtteri Bottas found his car was having its regular mechanical tantrums and decided that it didn't feel like working, with the Finn starting in the garage, then heading out for a lap, then back in again, then out again, before coming in for the rest of the session, the car seemingly more indecisive than me when I'm asked to attend a social event. But that wasn't the only action happening in the pit lane, as with Magnussen heading out onto the track, the Aston Martin mechanics decided it was the prime opportunity to become a nuisance, as they sent Seb Vettel out into the fast lane right in front of the Haas, with the Dane forced to lock up his rears to avoid hitting the German's car. But at least they were headed out onto the track, which was something Mercedes couldn't manage early on, with both cars still undergoing setup changes, as the team were desperately trying to find a setup that would work well around the circuit Gilles Villeneuve. A certain phrase involving turds and polishing comes to mind. But the final incident of note came about halfway through the session as the VSC was required to neutralise the track. Was it a car stuck in the grass? Debris on the track maybe? Nope, it was a Diet Coke can that had made its way onto the circuit. Other beverages are available. Excessive soft drink consumption may lead to issues with health, including but not limited to bad teeth, gums, diabetes and weight issues. Side effects may vary. Consult a doctor if you require additional advice. Soft drink disclaimer over. On to Saturday now, and there was big news for Charles Leclerc, as with engine components being taken, he joined Yuki Tsunoda by starting at the back of the grid. But I guess it's better to start at the back than to be finishing there, as has been the case for Ferrari power in recent times. Over at AlphaTauri, there was news as well, with team principal Franz Tost announcing that Pierre Gasly would be driving for the team in 2023. No thanks to Sergio Perez, whose good performances and contract extension were doing nothing short of destroying Pierre Gasly's Red Bull hopes and dreams. But onto the action now, and I think saying it was damp would be an understatement, as the rain was coming down, ensuring full wet running, which very quickly led to some off-track exploration, as Kevin Magnussen took his Haas over the grass before rejoining. But as the session went on, it did start to get a little bit drier and we saw some intermediate tyres come out, with the lap times performing similar to those on wets, but maybe just a little better. And it was also looking like we'd get through the session pretty much incident-free, until with 5 minutes left, a few drivers decided otherwise, with Magnussen heading off the track, then Carlos Sainz going onto the runoff, and finally Max Verstappen having a moment of his own. But at the end of it all, it was Alonso leading the way, as the Spaniard looked to be having his way in the tricky conditions. Into qualifying, and like FP3, it was full wet to start, with every car using the blue wall tyres to set their initial lap times. On a little side note, Canada is used to being pretty wet as it has the most lakes in the world, and one of these could be found at the Turn 1 apex, as every car was forced to either avoid it completely or drive through it like someone splashing people at a bus stop. And given the treacherous conditions, some drivers were struggling to get good laps in, along with a number deleted for track limits as cars would be bailing across chicanes, such as Norris and Perez having identical incidents at Turn 1, and Carlos Sainz at Turn 3, who decided to go and check out what was down the escape road. But these excursions were costing Checo in particular, as it wasn't until later in the session that he elevated himself out of the drop zone. And talking of the drop zone, out in Q1 in last place was not Nicholas Latifi for a change, though it was only Tsunoda who couldn't really bother to set lap times as he'd be starting at the back anyway. But then in 19th it was Latifi, with Stroll a place higher in 18th, as the reality sunk in for the Canadian fans that in no way, shape or form would they have any good drivers in 2022. Into Q2, and given the rain had stopped, there were a mix of intermediates and wet tyres being used. Normally they would be for driving round and setting lap times, but in the case of Sergio Perez, they were for binning your car into the wall, as the Mexican went nose first into the barriers and was out of the session. So here lies Sergio Perez's title hopes, Monaco 2022 to Canada 2022. But after the car was cleared, the session was restarted for everyone bar Lando Norris, as with his power unit not really feeling it, he couldn't set another lap time. But those that could were really improving, with every car that came across the line getting quicker and quicker and turning that P9, P10 danger zone into a revolving door. But by the end of it, the drivers that really missed out on Q3 were Alex Albon and Esteban Ocon, as Leclerc, Norris and Perez behind weren't really setting any late laps. Then into the final part of the session, and one thing that had been evident all qualifying was that it was Max Verstappen well and truly in the driver's seat, as the Red Bull man set a lap and then just went purple again and again and again. Over at Mercedes, in an effort to at least have some fun while driving their dog of a car, George Russell was going drifting, sliding around the track as he tried to get on top of the conditions, but with a few minutes to go, the Brit took a gamble nobody else was willing to take, as he rolled the dice heading out on slick tyres, which didn't work as he quickly found himself in the wall, having taken a trip round the edge of the Turn 1 lake. Now back to the drivers that used their brains and put the right tyres on for the conditions, and behind Max Verstappen the race was on for P2, as first Hamilton took it, before Carlos Sainz took it, and then they were both displaced by Fernando Alonso, as he would join Max Verstappen on the front row of the grid. So on to race day, and after almost missing the start because the TV director wanted to get all artistic with their camera angles, we had lights out and away we go. With Max Verstappen getting away well from pole, meaning we were all denied the Fernando Alonso dive bomb into turn 1. But there was contact in the opening lap a few cars back as Kevin Magnussen tried to go around the outside of Lewis Hamilton, with light contact damaging his front wing and eventually getting him a black and orange flag, meaning he had to come into the pits to get the damage repaired. With that early stop subjecting the Dane to what I call the Nicholas Latifi experience, being at the back from the start and staying there basically the whole time. Elsewhere on lap 1, we had an act of violence that Conor McGregor would be proud of, as Valtteri Bottas bailed over the final chicane and obliterated the bollard upon rejoining. Someone with slightly cleaner moves though was George Russell, as in the space of 6 laps he pulled off almost identical overtakes at the hairpin, getting past Schumacher, Ocon and then Magnussen. Now moving forward a few laps, and remember how I already said Checo's title hopes were in the graveyard? Well, that was even more the case now, as clearly Jos Verstappen had been tampering with the Mexican's car because it came to a stop at turn 3, with the number 11 Red Bull showing all the reliability of a McDonald's McFlurry machine. And this brought out a VSC, which then meant some cars came in, with the likes of Verstappen and Hamilton taking the early opportunity to box and put on some fresh tyres. And further back, others were pitting too, but someone that didn't was Alex Albon, meaning that he became the conductor of the day's first DRS train, holding up Bottas, Norris and Charles Leclerc, who had made his way up from the back to 13th. But out of those 3, it was Valtteri at the front of the train, meaning it took about 5 times longer than it should have for the faster cars to clear Albon. But elsewhere, someone doing alright was Mick Schumacher, as he was driving a fairly solid race and was sitting inside the top 10. Emphasis there on the was, as his car decided its best chance to win was to imitate the Red Bulls, just a shame it picked the wrong one, because like Perez, Mick's car ground to a halt at turn 3, which brought out another virtual safety car. And with that, a number of other cars, and anyone else that started on the mediums, came in to change tyres. Everyone that was except Fernando Alonso, as the Alpine team displayed the type of what is going on strategy that I would expect from Ferrari. But at least if you don't pit, there's no stop to go wrong, which was exactly what happened for Lando Norris, as after already being delayed from McLaren double stacking the cars, he also had to wait for the tyres to be brought out, with the only thing taking longer being the time it takes Valtteri Bottas to complete an overtake. But once the stops were over, it was just a case of waiting, and still waiting for something to happen, as the on-track entertainment was limited to us watching Lance Stroll form a DRS train of his own, as he kept Joe, Ricciardo and Tsunoda behind him. And fed up with being stuck behind the Canadian, Yuki decided he'd dive into the pits, as he was keen to set a good outlap and get the undercut. But maybe he was a little too keen. Yeah, I'd make some joke here about the crash, but it really does just speak for itself. But a consequence of the crash was the safety car coming out, meaning Carlos Sainz could take his second stop from the lead and slot in behind Max Verstappen on fresh tyres. And with the green flag on lap 54, he had 15 or 16 laps to get the first win of his career. Lap after lap he'd get the DRS and chase Verstappen down the back straight. And further back it was close as well, with Leclerc eager to pass some cars and limit the damage from starting at the back, with 2 great moves up the inside of Alonso and Ocon at the hairpin, elevating him into 5th place. And behind him, Valtteri Bottas wanted to get through too, but Fernando Alonso was having none of it as he wiggled and jiggled more than Louis Theroux to keep the Finn behind. If you know, you know. But all it did was get him a 5-second penalty for weaving, elevating Zhou and Bottas ahead of him. And then back towards the front, time was running out for Sainz to make a move, and eventually it did, as he had to settle for P2 behind Verstappen, with Hamilton taking P3 and the final spot on the podium. Anyways, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see some more F1 content, but until next time, take care.